Bonjour, bonjour, philosophers and readers of life. And if there is anything thematic about my channel and my videos, is it's a sort of intellectual exercise in the reading of life, and I like to draw from the ideas of philosophers and from my own experience when it's relevant to give those who, thankfully enough, view my videos and stick around. I love you guys. I'm so happy that I got this going. A thought just sort of came to me one day. What if I just took the simple approach of setting up my phone camera and thinking freely in order that others might be stimulated to think in these, what I think, are important directions. And I think it's possible to have a philologia is the Greek term, stance toward life, and the meaning of the Greek word is love of learning. And that this in itself, if one can have this attitude toward whatever condition one happens to find himself in or herself in, it goes a long, long way, as opposed to remaining in this state of naivete and judgment and prejudice. What's going on is all wrong, it should be this way, and you get yourself into this sort of intellectual and emotional net where you aren't able to adapt to what's going on right now because you just have this rigid feeling like you understand truly what's going on and what the value of certain experiences are without reflecting on them and, in a sense, attaining to a scientific point beyond them. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about phenomenology, particularly resorting to the Paris lectures of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. And I just wish I could communicate to you guys how important and truly, as I said before, revolutionary phenomenology as a method is. I would not call it a philosophy, not in the least. It is totally prior to that, way more rudimentary, way more fundamental. It is an approach you can take to any experience you happen to find yourself in, and even really toward your whole life. And in my own experience, there is a wide gap between the practice of what Husserl calls Epoché versus not doing that. And I have quite a few notes here in front of me, and believe me, I have plenty more just to register and try to formulate on my own the ideas that Husserl got across in that book. So profound. I can't stress that enough, and I highly suggest that anybody interested in this and maybe become intrigued by phenomenology owing to this video, highly encourage that you go check out this book. It is, without a doubt, among the most important that I have ever read. And as I said, it is pre-philosophic. It has nothing to do with certain concepts or certain moral judgments about what it is to be a human being and what we ought to do, what existence is, all of these things that philosophies and religions tend to venture to answer. None of that is done in phenomenology. In the Paris lectures, Husserl uses René Descartes, the well-known French philosopher, so-called father of rationalism, as an example of the phenomenological epoche, which is, as I said before, so profound in its implications and applications that I could never properly get it across to you unless you yourselves attempt to incorporate it into your life, which is actually surprisingly easy and doesn't require very much change to your life at all. It's everything remains the same, but you are not anymore so gullible and under the spells of your particular experiences, say of judgments or certain prejudices you have. You can actually watch the experience that you have of being prejudiced or feeling this way about this thing or these people. I want to show this post-it note, and with this I can explain in a sort of crude expositio crudus, I can explain, and I will bring that back up because I just flashed that very quickly, with this essentially formula for what it means to be a living human being with an active, continuous experience that I will show you again. You have this, and you see ego is written twice. It's the Latin term for I. Cogito, cogitatum. And over here, I'll move my finger. Everybody lives in this. Well, truly everybody lives in this, but until phenomenology came around, we often, quite naturally, it's nobody's fault, but we find ourselves in this, he says, immersed in this natural way of perceiving. And so to make this more concrete, ego cogito cogitatum, translated, means I think what is thought. And so, moment to moment, we have particular, distinct perceptions of very many different things. And cogito, I think, in Husserl's phenomenology, does not just mean what we tend to understand when we hear thinking, to think. This is what he calls intentional activities. And whatever perception we can highlight and isolate and point out as being some particular apprehension of some object of this act of perception. This is going on all of the time, moment to moment. It's the activity of consciousness, in a sense, sending itself to some object of perception. For example, and I could think of maybe an infinite number of ways in which the cogito can be applied. Recollection. I remember doing this thing on that day a few weeks ago. Or suddenly I have an insight, and it's a very fresh and new perception of something I don't recall ever seeing before. Or maybe I smell a delicious meal in the next room, and it's more of a sensation sort of perception. Well, the state of naivete, or immersion, as Husserl talks about in his Paris lectures, is we take these distinct and singular perceptions at face value, and we overlook, first off, that the experience happened at all, that it came to be, and secondly, the acts. So we have this sort of myopic and narrow view of the objects of perception, and broadly speaking, these are meanings. And in this parenthetic ego, what he calls the absolute ego, this is the house and the domain in which all of these singular and distinct perceptions that happen moment to moment always occur and must occur. Hypothetically, all possible consciousness and experience occur in this absolute ego. And yet, we, again, to no fault of our own, this is just how human experience happens naturally for all of us. We get so involved in this, our particular experiences, and the objects of our perceptions, that we miss out on the cogito, the acts, and we miss out on the basic residence in which all possible consciousnesses and perceptions do occur. That it's so radical, this absolute ego, that without it there would not be the single momentary perceptions. And also, he says again and again that it is filled with inborn or immanent possibilities of experience, that nothing we can think of as being a possible experience occurs outside of this. It's always, whatever the experience happens to be, the manifestation of possibility inborn to this. And so, if I see a lovely view and it kindles a sort of feeling of inspiration and wholeness in me, well, that understanding of the view as being something meaningful and beautiful is a possibility which had already been in this absolute ego. And all of the factors came together in that moment to make it actual. And it's very interesting. I like to think that Husserl's Phenomenology hits on a sort of religious truth that has been communicated in various ways. For example, in the New Testament, it's in the book of Ecclesiastes, I believe the book of Romans. Then Eastern philosophy is almost everywhere. And I want to use an example from alchemy that Jung has mentioned, I think at least once, that there is this saying that all proceeds from the one and returns to the one, which, in so many words, and this is just my interpretation, the multiplicity of our particular experiences, that we can experience so many different and distinct things, whether we're asleep or awake. All of that owes its occurrence and existence to some primordial fact, which, were it not a reality, then all that we experience as being particular realities would not be. That, as I think Sam Harris puts it sometimes in his description of consciousness, the mere fact of seeming, I mean, whatever we as individuals happen to be dealing with in a moment, there seems to be, or I'm talking to somebody, and I can tell that he is lying, but that's just my perception. Maybe he isn't even lying. Nevertheless, the mere fact that I've found myself in a state and situation where something seems to be the case, that is the sine qua non of consciousness. And there was another example, but it's leaving me at the moment. But that's really it, is that there is seeming, and that might be a little bit hard. It's not a very grammatically pretty way of putting it, but that's really what it comes down to, is that we can be dealing with realities, we could be dealing with mere appearances, and yet whatever the case happens to be, there's still the seeming there. And this is just basically the greatest mystery I can think of. And Husserl takes this as his starting point, that whatever that mystery is, for our purposes in phenomenology, we call it the pure absolute ego, in which all, and I mean all, possible experiences reside and can occur. That if we can become aware of that fact and not be naively immersed in the particulars of our experience, then we will be able to behold phenomena the more freshly and accurately. And that way, and this, there's so many profound things about phenomenology, but this allows us to, as Husserl put it, get a rounded view of whatever particular phenomena we happen to be dealing with, i.e., whatever perceptions we happen to be dealing with moment to moment, is that we don't take them at face value anymore. We are not immersed in their meanings as they first immediately occur to us, to our understanding, but we watch that act of coming to be of the phenomenon. We watch that act of understanding it in a certain way. We become cognizant of the particular activity that leads up to these particular perceptions. It's a sort of scientific approach to yourself and life altogether, lived experience. And it doesn't make you, people like to think that having a scientific view toward things means that you become cold and intellectual and cynical and all of those things. No. This is actually the opposite effects, at least for me, and this seems to be common. This seems to be agreed upon by people who have delved into phenomenology. Actually, you are saving yourself from a great deal of harm, particularly self-harm. There's just so much that we do to jeopardize and torment ourselves that we don't have to be doing, that we could get out of. But this is an insight that has rarely been communicated or taught anywhere, that you can get to this absolute pure ego by what Husserl calls Epoché, and that means generally suspension of judgment. And this term goes back to Greek philosophy, in particular Pyrrhonism. I have a quote from Sextus Empiricus, who defines epoche briefly in a way that seems to align well with what I have learned so far about it. Epoche is a state of the intellect on account of which we neither deny nor affirm anything. Anything at all. And if I can combine that with this term intentio here, intentiones, that intentio is the word from which our English word intention is derivative, and this, I use the Google dictionary often to find definitions, and there they translate this as stretching or purpose. So, day to day, we have all of these intenciones, intentional acts, which Husserl has described very well, all of these singular and one-sided perceptions of particular objects of consciousness. Whatever it is we're becoming aware of and comprehending with this strange awareness that we have inherited, those are the objects of consciousness. And so, in the stretching and the purposing toward these objects of consciousness, it is possible to adopt a stance of sobriety and modesty, presuppositionlessness, unassumingness, that even though, I want to stress here, this ego cogito cogitatum, this formula for all of the perceptions or musings that we can isolate, that goes on so naturally, and there's no way to stop that. If you are a living human being, moment to moment, you're going to have a thought, you're going to have a sensation, you're going to have a feeling, a recollection, etc., etc. Those all fit under cogito. That's the mode of awareness, how you are aware of the cogitatum, the object of awareness. In all of this automatic, inevitable activity of becoming aware of certain objects in a definite way, by definite activities, we can adopt a stance of epoche where we are neither denying nor affirming the total validity of these perceptions, that they just occur, as do weather events, as do our breathing. All of these very natural and continuous activities of nature and our own nature, we can, after having successfully achieved epoche and thereby reached the transcendental ego. By the way, there's a lot of terms that he uses. It's with all great thinkers, it's like learning a new language reading them. But we can attain to this and therefore not take these inevitable perceptions and judgments and prejudices, etc., that we all have, not take them as absolutely valid, and thereby save ourselves all the suffering and save others from our impositions and selfishness. We can mitigate so much of that, and in that way we don't harm others or ourselves as much as we have to. And to finish, there's so much overlap I have found in a lot of modern psychologic and philosophic works that I have read, and even stretching back to religious traditions, there's so much overlap in all of them across millennia of the description of states that one can attain to, states of consciousness. And I want to mention here one that Jung points out. There is what he calls the therapeutic effect par excellence in The Secret of the Golden Flower. I believe I mentioned this in another of my videos. Nevertheless, it bears repeating because it's so similar to what happens with Epoché, that the therapeutic effect that he always strives for in his patients, and that he, Jung, came to learn very well, is this, he said it figuratively, detachment from the world, that all of this inevitable activity of perception and understanding things that just goes on so necessarily for all of us all of the time, there's a way of not being enmeshed and entangled in that activity and identifying with your experience, identifying with yourself as moral subject who is totally responsible for the changing of things, is identical with the train of his own thought. No, you attain to some state much larger, much more conducive and sound and healthy than that. Because, let me tell you, at least it's been the case for me, and I've found this to be something that Jung talks about as well, and others certainly, to be in that, what Husserl calls, naive state of immersion in the immediately given world and immediately given perceptions, it can be a pretty bad time. I mean, there seems to be something psychologically incorrect about it, that people can do themselves a lot of hurt if, say, they made a mistake, they hurt somebody they love, and they're not really sure how to move forth other than to beat themselves up for it and just close their eyes to life. They're done with it. This is a place a psychological place that a lot of people reach, and if they have no intuition or intimation about this ability to detach from the situation, whatever it happens to be, well, then they're going to take their most violent and heinous thoughts toward themselves utterly seriously and agree with them, identify with them, and think, I deserve all of this pain, and I've been there, and it's a very emotional thing to talk about. But some people get so involved in that, whatever it is, the guilt, that they kill themselves or do something terrible. I mean, that's a real thing. And the possible benefit of this message of not a cold detachment, but a necessary and healthful detachment from the particular circumstances we find ourselves in, can be, just the benefits can be so valuable. And I hope that these sorts of teachings will begin to reach others, and that's why I do these videos, is that some of the things I read compel me to tell others about it however I can, because it could be the difference between someone ending their life or ending someone else's, or just being destructive, causing unnecessary damages, all because, you're not wrong. You found yourself in a very grueling psychological situation. This happens to all of us. I mean, that's going to happen to all of us if it hasn't already. What are we going to do then? That means everything. I mean, we're all going to be let down. We're all going to let others down. How do you deal with that? If you get so involved with the devil speaking in you, say, well, he's going to take you down, because this healthy detachment, I call it, I think it's so important that this so-called devil, he speaks to all of us, I believe. And if you're not careful, he can take you out. But if you can just look at the devil as being a particular experience or possible experience in the container, the domain of an absolute ego, to which you can become aligned, in which you can situate yourself and look at yourself not as I fill in the blank with your own name, as some subject or soul suspended in somewhere in nothingness in your body or anything like that. This is the transcendental ego is nameless. It's this absolute consciousness whereby you're not even identified with your name and place and station, any of those things anymore. You still have experience in the context of your own body, unless you say close your eyes and carry the Epoché even further. Then you can actually forget yourself, and this is the sort of enlightenment that a lot of spiritualists, for example, quietists, speak of, and it's so powerful. And in a word, it's so important not to get too entangled with your own particular experience. We all make mistakes. We all fuck up. And if you can still, in face of that, just get beyond your situation, look at it for what it is, and not be stirred into the mixture of the painful and regretful feelings, then you can get past that. These times of trouble and doubt, I think, are necessary stages in our psycho-spiritual development. And if you can become conscious of that and realize that you don't have to be identified with the pain and the torment that's going on inside you, but you can get to an absolute consciousness where you are not denying or affirming the reality of what the devil is telling you. You're just looking at it, talking from this pure home or state. And I'll end it here, but Heidegger talks about being, man's return to the basic fact of being as his regaining home. And I find that to be very similar to Husserl's teaching. And so I'm going to go. Thanks, guys.